Hello and welcome to week 1 tutorial on pivot tables. We're going to be using the same Excel file for each part of for multiple videos here, starting with creating a new pivot table and setting some value field settings and putting a field in a row. So to begin with, let's download our file and save it. When you save a file from Canvas using Google Chrome as your browser, you get a little tab. It should be, if you need to go back to the file, it should be located in your Downloads folder. So let's open the Excel file, and then we have to enable the editing. And let me zoom in. So you can see I have an instructions worksheet that's going to kind of guide us through the different steps that we're going to go through in creating these pivot tables. So first of all, what are pivot tables? Pivot tables are kind of interactive tables and charts that summarize data. They allow users to take a large data set and view a summary of it, and they also allow you to specify interactive dimensions to point and click and see different subsets of data easily. So it sort of turns Excel into kind of a static one-time snapshot of data to something that can be interactive between the user and the data. And they're fairly easy to set up and have become pretty popular. So let's look at the first example I'm going to use is a really basic data set focusing on income. So yearly earnings is kind of our field of interest here, and we have 3 other columns: education, race, and gender. So basically we want to look at how much more money do you earn if you stay in school, or how much more do certain genders earn than others, or what's the difference between different earnings according to different racial breakdowns and different combinations of these factors. Before I get into doing any sort of pivot table work, I would encourage you to look at your data and see if everything is clean and all the entries are how they're supposed to be. So if I just kind of scroll down the data, you notice there's some blanks in the yearly earnings, or zeros. So one thing I might do is just do a sort. So I could go to home and then sort and filter. I like to do a custom sort, and notice by default it says my data has headers. I can sort by yearly earnings, and if I scroll down I can see, starting in row 2 all the way down, I can see I have a few hundred, 300 something blanks, but there's over 6,000 total entries in this data set. So it's probably not unreasonable that you might have 300 some odd people that would be unemployed out of 6,000. So I'm just going to leave those entries in and assume that they're not erroneous, but that the values are valid, that there actually are supposed to be zeros. So without further ado, let's learn how to make some pivot tables. In order to create a pivot table, you click on a cell anywhere in the data set, and then go to the Insert tab in your menu and click on Pivot Table in the upper right. And you get a window that pops up that first asks you what range the data is in. And since I only had one cell selected, it picked all the consecutive data that was adjacent to that. So all the way, starting at the top left, A1, all the way down to the bottom right, D6367, so the entire data set. Let me cancel out of here for a second and just show you. If I were to have selected, say, 13 rows of data and then clicked on Pivot Table, it would default to the data that I had selected, A1 through D13, which in this case is not what I want. So I'm going to go back and select one cell and make sure I have the entire data set included. And then the second part of this window is choosing where you want the table to appear. In this case, we want to start a new worksheet for the results. Sometimes you want to have multiple analysis on the same worksheet, in which case you would pick existing worksheet and maybe select a particular spot in the worksheet that you want the table to be included. But for this one, we'll just accept the defaults and click OK. And we get this new worksheet that looks a little cryptic. It has this pivot table 1 here, and it has these windows on the right that have our 4 fields: education, earnings, race, and gender. And then you have these 4 areas below: filters, columns, rows, and sum value. I always start by choosing what value I want to summarize. In this case, I want to choose yearly earnings. So I'm going to select that value and drag it down to that sum value area. And you notice that the spreadsheet has changed. I have a heading, sum of yearly earnings, and I have a figure there of, I don't know exactly how much that is, maybe 2.4 million or something. But I have other things I want to analyze the earnings by. Now in my list of instructions here, I selected the data, I placed annual earnings. I'm going to skip ahead to part 6 here just to show you. I'm going to put years of education in the row. So I'm going to go back to sheet 1, and I'm going to put education in the row, and it's going to show me that people with 8 years of education. Let me add a quick format here. So I'm going to select the data in the earnings and apply a currency format to it. And then I'm going to decrease the decimals. There's no reason to have 0.00 at the end of all those. So this is going to show me that people that have 8 years of education, if you added up all their earnings, it adds to a little bit less than $2.6 million. Whereas people who have 9 years of education had a total earnings of 1.2 million. But the way we have this set up doesn't really lend itself to any insights, because there are different numbers of people who had 8 years of education versus 9 versus 10 in the data set. However, if I change this, if I click on this drop-down box and go to this option that says Value Field Settings, I get a list of different options. In this class, we're going to sometimes we'll use sum. It might be appropriate for some analysis. We'll use count sometimes, and we'll use average sometimes. In this case, if we use average, the results make a lot more sense. So on average, people who stayed in school for 8 years only earned an average of $17,000 a year, whereas if you stayed in an extra year, you have $24,000. It actually goes down from there, but some of these might have small sample sizes. But in general, it shows an upward trajectory where the more years of education you have, the higher earnings. I'm just going to, before I stop this part of the video, I'm going to do a little bit of cleanup where it says row labels. I'm going to abbreviate that as years of education. And where it says average of yearly earnings, I'll just call it average earnings. And then I'm going to move between the two columns and double click to space to resize the columns. So if you move your cursor to the top between the column headings until your symbol becomes that little cross and double click, It'll size the columns just as wide as they need to be to show the data. And lastly, I'm just going to give the name of the worksheet a meaningful name, and I'll call it Earnings by Years of Education. And lastly, I'm just going to save the file.